Robert Breedlove, welcome to the channel.
Lucas, oh man, thank you for having me.
Today, I wanted to ask you some questions. I had some ideas to throw your way, and you had some ideas as well, particularly pertaining to rationality. But I'd like to start with just a brief introduction. You're the host of the What is Money show. Can you tell the listeners a bit about this show, what it stands for, and how you started it?
Yes, well, it's a good question. It's a good philosophical question, actually. Where does anything ever start?
Mm-hmm.
All right, we always say, something like the Fed started in 1913, and like, sure, it was legally ratified and brought into existence that year, but when did it really start, right? When did,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, the people that incepted the Fed, which is the central bank of the United States, drew inspiration from those who had came before them. Obviously, the plans were put into motion before it was ratified legally. So, in many ways, I can only speak to my own life, but I feel like my entire life has been kind of setting me on this course. Um, I grew up as a very curious kid. My mom, I think, got tired of me pestering her with so many questions. So she encouraged me to pick up reading at a pretty young age to answer my own questions. That became a lifelong habit. And I think I was very interested in economics in my late teens, early 20s. I read The Economist magazine for a long time, trying to figure that out, um, which in hindsight isn't very useful because it's based largely on Keynesian economic pseudoscience. I eventually discovered an economics newsletter, which I don't recall the name of actually, but it had recommended the book The Creature from Jekyll Island. And that was the book that initially answered my big, I guess, underlying question. I didn't realize at the time, but the underlying question in my curiosity about stock markets and bonds and all of this business speak I heard people use, but I didn't understand, was really underlying all of that jargon was the question about money. Like, what is money? What is this thing everyone's, acting in pursuit of? Um, so that, and in the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, it talks about the inception of the Federal Reserve, talks about the history of central banking, and it talks about the nature of money. So that was my introduction to the topic. And it was also, it left the psychological mark on me that central banking is the most problematic, to put it lightly or nicely, institution in the world. I would go so far as to call it malevolent, actually, that it is an institution of theft, deceit, and violence. It underlies and funds all statism, statism being the monopoly on coercion, compulsion, and violence. So um, that definitely got me interested. And then but at the time, there was no solution to central banking. It was just like seeing the belly of the beast, but not knowing. At the end of the book, actually, I had the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island on the show, G. Edward Griffin. And at the end of that book, he says the best way to slay the beast is with 1,000 lances of truth. And so at the time, I thought truth meant buying people copies of that book and encouraging them to read it. And with our heightened awareness or increased understanding of the beast, we would, pierce it, quote unquote, with a lance of truth. And that's what would bring it down. Which I tried actually. I bought the book for a number of people. Some people read it and they were just like, okay, what am I supposed to do with this? And the whole lance of truth theory quickly fizzled out. And I just went on with my life. I got a degree in accounting and finance, undergraduate master's degree, and I basically became a fiat chasing business guy. Initially, I was in public accounting. Later, I was in private industry as a financial chief, mostly focused in technology. I grew up with computers and on computers. I'm 38 years old, so I'm an old millennial.
Mm-hmm.
Old enough to remember time before smartphones, but young enough to have. I guess I got my first smartphone when I was in my early 20s. I don't remember exactly when, but So kind of on that cusp. And eventually discovered Bitcoin, basically. And Bitcoin is this hyper object of some kind. Like we're really struggling to put words to it, as my entire podcast catalog can testify.
Mm.
Trying to define money, trying to define Bitcoin. The natural first question is, what is Bitcoin? Well, easy answer to that. Bitcoin is money. Okay. Second question is, what is money? Down the rabbit hole you go.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody can clearly define or clearly answer that question. Um, I mean, actually, many people can clearly answer the question, but there's such a wide variety of answers and they all make sense. So you quickly realize, for me, the realization has been the limitations of language. And that's largely what we talk about on the show. We talk about the nature and history of money and all of the domains that it touches, you know, anthropology, technology, physics, psychology, sociology, politics, etc. Right? It goes into all these domains, game theory, even metaphysics. Like we get metaphysical on the show, an entire series about metaphysics,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
all using that question as kind of our guidepost. Um, but for me, a major realization through this journey has been language is simultaneously indispensable to us rational animals. It's as indispensable as it is insufficient. All right, there's the old quote. I don't know the name of the individual to attribute it to, but the map is not the territory.
Mm.
Language is the map, right? Discrete data packets based on social consensus so that the word only works if you and I assign roughly the same meaning to the word. And to the extent that we don't assign the same meaning to the word is largely the extent to which we talk past one another in an argument. So, indispensable for nonviolent human cooperation, collaboration, communication, but simultaneously insufficient in that the map is not the territory.
Mm.
Reality is much more complex, fluid, interconnected, relational, dynamic, changing, unpredictable, ineffable, right? Ineffable, beyond words, right? The fact that we even have a word for that which is beyond words is a testament to the limitations of language.
Yeah.
And so, but again, it's insufficient perhaps, but also indispensable. It's somewhat of a paradox. It's the best tool we've got for mapping reality. And so, evaluating how language actually works, looking at its limitations, um, leads you into this obviously the conversation about knowledge, right? How do we know what we know? What is epistemology? How do we construct knowledge? How do we argument about what we know and what we don't know? How do we disconfirm things? What are the axioms we can use to build our knowing upon, to deduce our theorems from? And all of this feeds into the discussion about money because money is one of these. If you could say that language, natural language, like in the sense of words and grammar, syntax, is probably the most important relational tool human beings have, meaning that the purpose of that tool is just for us to relate to one another, literally, to turn our thoughts, experiences, ideas into some common code that we can then communicate with each other across space and across time, right? As we accumulate knowledge, as we write books, as we write blogs, whatever the thing may be, make podcasts. So it is this very effective relational tool, but it's not the only very effective relational tool. It's not enough, actually. And so I would say the verdict is out for me as to whether natural language or money is a more important relational tool. because money is a very useful definition of it in this context is that money is the language of human action. And so it is allowing us to relate to one another. Who has provided useful production and not and who has provided more useful production than they have consumed? So when you go to work, you engage in production, you contribute to the production process, right? That the world is the market of the world is generating goods and services that we all depend upon. And you're contributing to that to some small part in your job. And the extent to which you contribute in a way that people find valuable or people find significant or useful above and beyond what you consume from that output of goods and services is your claim on the wealth of the world, right? It is, you can think of money as productivity points. The
Mm.
more productive you are, which is to say the more you produce in excess of what you consume, the more savings you have. And that's actually the technical economic definition of savings is production that has not yet been consumed. So all of that sort of complexity we abstract into money, and people don't understand when you say the word savings. People don't think about a subsistence fund of goods that have been produced and not yet consumed. They think about dollars in a bank account or Bitcoin in a Bitcoin wallet, right? They just think they abstract into this language called money. And then that's very useful because we can all communicate and negotiate and execute trades much more effectively using this economic lubricant called money. So again, just like with language, like how could we share our ideas and experiences with one another without language, right? We'd be standing around the campfire, hooping and hollering and making sounds, maybe to try and, drawing on the wall, the cave wall, maybe to try and draw some kind of symbol of an animal. And we get this very low throughput data transmission. But with language, we can get very precise and articulate and, weave in and out of different domains. We can go from the abstract to the physical and back, and we can metaphorize. And so it rapidly accelerates or expands the throughput with which we can communicate with one another, which is to say the throughput with which we can connect our minds. And money does something similar, but in a way that is maybe a higher signal, right? We have these adages like talk is cheap,
Mm.
put your money where your mouth is. Money is telling us something a bit more, that there's more significance there, right? If someone says, oh, I love your painting, like, oh, great, that's a nice compliment. But if someone says, I want to buy your painting for $10 million, that's a bit louder of a signal, right? That's someone that's invested energy, right? They've produced more than they've consumed to create that $1 million or its equivalent in goods and services. And they're willing to transfer the product of that energy and sacrifice of theirs to you in exchange for the energy and sacrifice you put into your painting. Whereas the words are cheap, right? Love the painting.
Mm.
Doesn't cost me a lot. Took me a breath, a little bit of knowledge, and there it is. So we're fundamentally rational animals. Communication is paramount to the scaling of rationality, and natural language and money are our most effective multi-purpose slash relational tools. And that's, I guess, a taste of what we talk about on the show.
Beautiful. Yeah, I was very surprised actually because I got into your channel through wanting to learn about investing. And I think you appeared on one of the
One thing we
podcasts.
don't talk about.
Yeah. Exactly. And you kind of convinced me about Bitcoin more from a philosophical perspective, which also allowed me to not worry about the price or any of these things. And very quickly, I was just surprised by the level of guests. I think a lot of
Mm.
people would benefit from listening to your first episodes with Michael Saylor. He really goes from first principles into explaining, well, eventually why Bitcoin, but it goes through history and all these domains that you mentioned before, and it's a fascinating route. And I think Yeah, I think it's beautiful that it leads to so many different places. I also wonder if one of the reasons why that happens is because it's an absolute question you ask, what is money? And
Mm,
it's led me to wondering how many other things you can do that with. Because money is one thing and it's, as you say, it's very profound, but I think you could do that with so many ideas, I guess, where you just ask that question and eventually it leads you to the totality of of
mm,
reality almost.
mm.
And is this something that you were thinking about before, like these philosophical topics? Is this something that money led you toward, or were you already oriented into this direction before that?
So I've always been naturally inclined to be philosophical. Um, as my friends put it, they would always say, you really suck at small talk.
Mm,
And so I'm just like, I guess I just appreciate, again, curiosity, right? I'm a curious kid. So I've always appreciated deeper conversations.
yeah.
Um, and your question, is it possible to do this with other things? Someone told me this recently and I looked it up. Apparently, you can go to any Wikipedia article and you can click the first hyperlinked word and you can keep clicking the first hyperlinked word in each article, successive article that it takes you to. And in 98%, I think is the number of cases, you will end up on the Wikipedia philosophy page.
Mm,
So it's just like, it's just like the 3-year-old, right? Why, why,
yeah.
why, 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 why? And eventually the parents just like, I don't know, like I give up. There's this underlying philosophy in all of our thinking and understanding and knowing of the world, right? That we had this, there's like a latent programming. Um, and you may have also noticed that in an attempt to define any word, you always encounter more words, right? Words are self referential, right? Every word is defined in terms of other words. And so you could think about these things as like, when I say it's a relational tool, it's like a self referential ratio of meaning, right? In a ratio, you have the top number and the bottom number. That's the numerator and the denominator. So when I spit out a ratio like 3/4, I'm looking at the quantity 3 in terms of the quantity 4. And so that 4 is my frame of reference in that ratio. Um, but you can basically do that with anything, right? That's how, again, this is the root word of rationality, right?
Mhm.
Ratio, it's a tool, it's a mathematical tool for comparing and contrasting different aspects of a thing. So you could also ask, how many swans are on Lake Erie, right? That's a ratio. You're looking at
Mhm.
the numerator, number of swans, denominator, Lake Erie, and you can establish a number from that. And this, this is, I guess, pointing to the inherent rationality of words, right? They are allowing us to triangulate on meaning, but the full meaning of whatever we're talking about is never containable in any one word because
Mhm.
one word is defined by other words. And so if you double click on the word, you get another set of words, and you can double click each word in that definition, and you're going to get another set of words, and so on and so forth ad infinitum. So you end up in this loop, right? Where, well, words can only define other words. How does the meaning of words ever come into words if it's always words defined by words defined by words? And this is a very interesting area, and I'm writing a piece on this right now. And apparently, there's some disagreement between, say, the Neoplatonist
Mhm.
and the followers of Plato and the predecessors of Plato, um, and Aristotle, Ayn Rand, the Aristotelians. And I'm not fully educated on this topic, so I might be speaking out of line. But my understanding at this moment is that the Neoplatonists essentially believe that at some point language gives out, that capital T ultimate reality, truth is beyond words, right? You cannot encapsulate the totality of reality inside of language, right? Language is, it's much more like I was saying earlier, the map is not the territory, right? Language is a mapping tool, a discrete data mapping tool for this infinitely or nearly infinitely complex fluid reality, something like that. So, you know, admitting my bias here, I'm obviously more of a Neoplatonist. Whereas Aristotle and Rand believe that there's something objectively true about language, that it actually, we have very basic concepts that we then amalgamate into steadily more complex concepts, and you build up into these, very abstract words, justice, truth, beauty, goodness, etc. But if you decompose those, you can go back into basic concepts like, rock, tree, cat, something like that. Um, but the fundamental, well, and again, this is my understanding. I'm still working on this. My understanding of the fundamental difference between the two is that Rand and Aristotle think that language can contain reality, right? That knowledge, it can be total. And I think Neoplatonists look at it as something more like a provisional tool, right? That it's like you're mapping the coordinates of an area, but depending on, well, your purpose of the map, where you are in that territory, what you're trying to do, like all of these things, well, different maps serve different purposes, right? A map of polar coordinates is really useful when you're at the North or South Pole, but it's not so useful when you're at the equator. So the map is the utility of the map is dependent upon your purpose and your aim in a way. So different language suits different ends, let's say. Whereas Rand and Aristotle look at it as something a bit more absolute, I
Yeah.
guess, and unchanging. And so, um, yeah, I think that words, as a more of a Neoplatonist, I think that words are these self-referential ratios of meaning, but we try to use them to get beyond words, right? That's almost the point of rationality itself. The rationality exists to constantly undermine itself, right? We want a higher resolution answer, you know? So if we look at the world of physics, for instance, you might have very basic Newtonian model of the universe. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Um, that's very useful at one resolution of analysis, but when you get a higher resolution, like a quantum level, well, then all of a sudden things look much more probabilistic, right? Than they
Yes.
do definite.
Yeah.
There's not A causes B. It's not a billiard ball mechanical universe. The metaphor fails, and the
Hmm.
the world starts to look much more energetic, probabilistic. Time does weird things. It's you need a different metaphor basically. So I say all this because I think is something I'm really interested in now, and it's largely influenced by this book here, Metaphors We Live By.
Yes. George
And they
Lakoff.
also they also wrote another book, Where Math Comes From. And they argue that really are the way we think, not just language itself, not just our linguistic structures, to which, like, so our linguistic structures are mapped onto conceptual structures, which would be our ideas about things. And then the words are coins, if you will, for are the ideas, to use a money metaphor, that are the way we structure our concepts is actually a metaphorical process. And the essence of metaphor is thinking about one thing in terms of another thing. Right. So a word like understand, Vervaeke turned me onto this too. The word understand is a metaphorical word,
Hmm.
right? We are invoking our experience of standing beneath something to gain a deeper perspective of its inner workings, we're invoking our experience of that in three-dimensional space, right? Maybe you're standing, maybe you're laying under the car, right? You backed yourself under the car to look under the bottom of it to see how it actually works. Or maybe you're looking at the meat beneath the surface of an iceberg, right? You're looking beneath the surface of the water to see that, oh, there's so much more iceberg than I thought was there. Or
Hmm.
you're looking at the root system of a tree, right? Now it's interconnected to the entire forest, and every root system is interconnected to every other root system via mycelium, right? You're looking beneath the surface to gain a deeper understanding of how the tree ecosystem works. That's a metaphorical word, right? That is metaphor right there. Understand, to stand beneath, to gain a deeper perspective on something. And this is why we have deep conversations, right? This is why we try to get to the substance of things, right? The substance, to stand beneath.
Hmm.
So it's I think this is where, this is my view. It's like it's a metaphorical process, that we have experiences in reality, in physical reality, let's say, that we can then map onto our experiences of concepts, or our interaction with conceptual objects or abstract objects in cognitive space rather than physical space.
Yeah.
And then there's also feedback the other direction, because as we change the way we think about things, while we invent new tools and technologies that help us deal with the world in actual new ways, like we actually have different physical experiences. We're doing it right now, right? We're having a remote Zoom call on a piece of technology that just did not exist 30 years
Hmm.
ago.
Hmm.
So we've changed the types of experiences that are possible for human beings in physical space by upgrading our conceptual space.
Yeah.
And we upgrade our conceptual space by using better metaphors. And it's fascinating too, because I think the reason I think about language in this way is because I have the physical experience of interacting with computers and software. The analogy or the metaphor I often use for natural language is that it is an open source cognitive software, right? English is something that none of us invented, none of us own it. We all participate in it. We all modify it to some extent, right? Here and there, like some, not you, you probably didn't invent any new words, but you've probably seen some new words come online over the years. They come online. By the way, I'm using a digital metaphor right there. Neologisms, new words come into being largely because of new advances in technology. Also, new phrases, right? You'll hear people say, like, oh, that's a feature, not a bug.
Hmm.
It's like, well, again, that wouldn't have made sense 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Um, you're, I think you're from the Netherlands, right?
I am.
My girlfriend's from the Netherlands. She saw a lighthouse on the beach here near her home the other day. And she goes, "Oh, it's down there near the fire tower." I'm like, "The fire tower? What's a fucking fire tower?" It's like, "Oh, you mean the lighthouse?" She's like, "Oh, yeah, we call it a fire tower." And I started
Yeah.
thinking, I was like, "Oh, that's because when lighthouses were built in the Netherlands, it was a fire tower.
Yeah.
You guys didn't have electric lights, right? You built a tower and you put a fire on the top of it so ships could know where the land was.
Hmm.
But when it was built in the United States, we had electric lights by then, or I'm not sure, maybe not by then, but close to then.
Yeah.
And we call it a light tower instead of a fire tower, or we call it, yeah, light tower, what, lighthouse. Sorry,
Lighthouse. Yeah. You
using
got it.
myself, lighthouse instead of a fire tower. So it's through technological change. There's this weird co-evolutionary dynamic between our physical changes in the technological landscape, and thus physical changes in our experience of how we engage with the world, that has feedback into our conceptual understanding of the world, which then helps us gain a better, deeper understanding of the world. And then we invent new ways of dealing with the world. We get new tools and technologies, which then changes the way we deal with it, and so on and so forth. So this is like my working, sorry to go way off the deep end. Um, my kind of working thesis for how human cognition comes online. Like we're
Yeah.
basically, and I'm not, this is not mine, by the way. I shouldn't take credit for it. There's a book titled How Things Shape the Mind. And this is it's about a subset of cognitive archaeology called material engagement theory. And that's what he basically says. Like, humans are defined by sophisticated tool use. And it's through this sophisticated tool use and manipulation of our environment and the creation of new tools that help us engage physically with the world in new and novel ways that causes us to change the way we think and talk and so on and so forth. So, um, yeah, I'll leave it at
Beautiful.
that. Sorry, that
Yeah,
was a
yeah.
long spiel.
Awesome. It's very crystallized. I like it. I can tell you've spent a lot of time
It's not
making it
crystal.
clear.
Like it's all edge of my own understanding kind of stuff, but
That's my favorite type of stuff, I think. I
okay,
have
great.
Karen Wong, who has a channel on which she has a lot of physicians, I guess, and a lot of scientists. She's always saying that the best conversations are when two people are at the edge of their understanding. That's
Yes,
that's where the most insights seem to come to fruition.
for sure. Genuine dialogue.
Yeah, exactly. Or
Yeah.
John Vervaeke's Dialogos.
Dialogos. Yeah.
Exactly. When you said that language is, I guess, insufficient, I was also thinking about what you said, that some theories are insufficient, or maybe theories by definition are insufficient. And it made me think about this idea of a theory of everything that Kurt Jamungu
Mm.
endeavors to speak about and tries to figure out, I guess. Do you think it's possible to have a theory of everything, or do you think it's a self-defeating pursuit?
It's a great question. Yeah, when I was really young and I started reading a lot, the first area of my curiosity that I tried to satisfy was astronomy, astrophysics. Um, Growing up in Tennessee, I spent a lot of time outdoors, and so I was always very flabbergasted by the night sky. I think is probably the only right word. Just like, whoa, what is going on? There's so, when your mom and other adults tell you like, oh, these are all other stars, and you're like,
Mm-hmm.
holy shit, there are so many of them. And then someone blew my mind further, and they're like, well, they're not all stars. Some of them are galaxies, which are actually billions or trillions of stars in one dot. I was just like, oh my God. I was literally having my mind melt as a child. And so when I started reading for myself, I'd go to the bookstore and I went straight to, I was like, where do I read about stars and, the cosmos and all that? And so they take you to the astronomy and the astrophysics section. And I would just read the hardest books I could find. So it was like Brian Greene's Elegant Universe, Stephen Hawking, Universe in a Nutshell. I think Stephen Hawking even has a book, The Theory of Everything, if I recall correctly, um, etc. And so those are my first, like that's where I really tried to sate my curiosity initially, was in that department. And now, well, for the longest, I really thought physics was the main thing, right? Like if we could figure out the theory of everything, then almost like I was talking about Rand and Aristotle earlier, that the the notion that you can contain the totality of reality into language or into a formula or into, a theoretical framework.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I subscribed to that, I guess, as a kid. What do I know? I was like, I just people writing about it, talking about it, pursuing it, and I was like, oh, that's so cool, so interesting. I wonder if it'll happen. What would happen if we figured it out? But today, no, no, I
No,
don't think so. I don't think so. I think it's, I think, yeah. Well, what could we say here? We only see 5% of the visible light spectrum, for instance, right? Um, we have invented instruments that allow us to perceive the other 95%. Right? You've heard of infrared, ultraviolet, right? These are the things that are below and above. Again, a metaphor, below and
yeah.
above. They're not actually below and above anything. They're just different frequencies. They're outside of the frequency which we can perceive. Um, you know, there is a beginning of time according to physics, right? Like that paradoxical there. It's like how could time have a beginning? What's before time? There's something outside of space, according to Big Bang Theory, right? There's a horizon, the cosmic microwave background.
Hmm.
And again, I would also point to that book where math comes from, because that's been a long outstanding question for me. It's like, what is the deal with math? Like, of all the things we know, math seems to be extremely useful. It's like the language of Mother Nature. But how do we anchor that to reality? Like, what is the story there? And again, I haven't fully read the book. I don't fully understand whether the authors are correct or not, but they argue that math itself is a metaphorical structure. And they describe how there could be different types of math, based on the agent that created it and whatnot. So, anyways, I
Oh,
don't want to. It doesn't degenerate into relativism for me, though,
no.
because there are things that I think we can say with certainty. So, and this is where I'll go into Austrian economics, because words, right? And this is the ancient Taoist, right? The finger that points at the moon is not the moon,
Hmm.
right? Or Alan Watts, don't mistake the menu for the food, right? The map is not the territory. We keep saying the same thing. It's like there are symbols and reference, and we need the symbols to compress data about the reference and talk about them and think about them and reflect upon them. But there is a possibility or a threat of mistaking the symbol for the referent sometimes, right? Mistaking the money for the wealth, mistaking the word for the deed, things like this. And so that's where this humility needs to come into play, that, we're dealing with data compression when we use language and when we look at the world, we look through instrumentation, but there's always going to be something we're not seeing, right? When you compress data, you're omitting things.
Yeah.
Right? You may have mapped certain features of the territory, but by definition, because you have mapped and emphasized certain features, you have omitted other features,
Hmm.
omitted other things. And so no matter which way you look, you're always omitting something. This is also Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, right? You can measure either the speed or the direction, but not the speed and the direction, right? And the
Yeah.
extent to which you measure the speed is the
Yes.
extent to which you can't measure the direction, and vice versa.
Yes.
So there's this metaphorical trade-off. There's also this with space and time, by the way. The more rapidly you move through space, which is to say, the closer you approach the speed of light, the less affected you are by time, right?
Mm.
Such that if you are a photon moving at the speed of light, you're unaffected by time. Whereas in theory, if you could stop, and not move at all, well, then you'd be maximally affected by time, which is that boggles the mind too to think about that. But so again, there's this metaphorical structure to the way we perceive the most fundamental things in the world. So, how does this not degenerate into relativism? Well, fortunately, I think there are certain things we can say, certain assemblages of words we can create that are axiomatic, meaning that they are anchored in something deeper than language, and therefore they are unshakable by language. They are unbreakable. They are foundational assumptions, right? You know, things you can hang your hat on, so to speak. I don't know what other way to say it, but this is the meaning of axiom. And for Mises is the one of the great Austrian economists.
Hmm.
This is I think this is the most important axiom that I know of at this point in time, and maybe the closest thing we have to a theory of everything. And this is going to be so dissatisfying for anyone that's super into physics like I used to be. But that axiom is man, it's the axiom of action. Man, or human, if you want to be universal about it, humans must act. And what this means is that humans purposefully use means to pursue valued ends. So, to try and say it a slightly different way, humans use tools to try and attain aims, right? We are aiming creatures. We have goals, right? We have goals. Right? I'm trying to go from A to B. And then we have plans. what I'm going to do and how I'm going to maneuver between A and B such that I can get from A to B. And we can also adapt, right? If we get off track, say, oh shit, I ended up at C instead of B. Well, then I can replan, reorient, establish, drop old tools, pick up new tools, create new tools for that matter, make new plans, improvise, as you might say, and redirect myself towards B. Or I can say, you know what, B was a bad idea. I need to go to G, right? So we are these aiming creatures that move through space and time, through social space, through cognitive space, through abstract space, through physical space. And anything that we do that's not purely reflexive behavior, like when the doctor taps your knee with a hammer and your leg shoots out, well, that's not really your purpose. That's like purpose that's hardwired into you, if you will, by evolution. And we have a lot of those things, by the way. This might be an apocryphal story, but Charles Darwin was apparently looking at a snake in a glass box, and the snake would strike at him, and it was in a glass box, so the snake couldn't get through. And Darwin was trying to see if he could prevent himself from recoiling when the snake would strike at him, but he couldn't do it. Right? It's hardwired into him. If you try to keep your eyes open when you sneeze, like I've never seen anyone that can do it. Right? There's certain things that are reflexive that we can't do anything about. Doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter what your purposes are, your means or your ends. Like doesn't care. It doesn't. Your body or your physiology doesn't necessarily care about your purpose in that instance. So that's where economists differentiate between action and behavior, right?
Yes.
Behavior would be purely reflexive acts, let's say, whereas action would be purposeful behavior, something like that.
Okay.
Now, here's why it's axiomatic.
Mm-hmm.
Give me a counter argument to why humans don't use means to pursue ends. Like, please, what you got? What's your best shot?
I'm not gonna try.
Here's the reason why it doesn't work. Because, and this is from Hoppe, great book, great short book, Economic Science and the Austrian Method. In any attempted counter argument against the axiom of action, you are using the means of argumentation to the end of refuting the axiom of action.
Yes.
Therefore, you are, through action, demonstrating that the axiom of action is true, despite what you are explicating, which is that
Mm-hmm.
it is not true. Your actions speak louder than your words. Hence, the axiom of action is true. It's irrefutable. And so, words, again, back to language, words are tools. Words are tools. How can you use a tool not on purpose? I can't shoot a gun without intending to shoot the gun. I'm not going to, I mean, you can accidentally shoot the gun,
Yeah.
but you're not going to use it purposefully towards certain ends, like hitting the target. I mean, you might get lucky once accidentally shooting the gun and hitting the target. You might get lucky once,
Mm-hmm.
once in 100 billion trillion, whatever odds of the universe. But if you're going to do that repeatedly and, somewhat predictably, there has to be a purposeful use of that tool toward a valued end, right? I have to know how to operate the gun. I have to know how to load the gun. I have to know how to aim the gun. I have to know how to shoot the gun. I have to know how to clean the gun, right? The same is true with words. Like when we use words, we are implying, we are demonstrating that we are purposeful actors with everything that we say. You can't use a word unpurposefully, I guess, unless you're Joe Biden, right? You can just get up there and blah, 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 blah. Sorry, political joke. Um, these, again, what makes humans different than other animals? Like, well, a lot of people would say, oh, language, right? Rationality, logos. Again, back to that book on material engagement theory, how things shape the mind. I would say it's very sophisticated tool use. The most sophisticated, or among the most sophisticated tools that we use, is language, right? It's a cognitive software that we use to interconnect our minds. There's also money, another one of these interesting, well, is money hardware? Is money software? I don't know. It's somewhere in between, right?
Yeah.
Vervaeke uses the term psychotechnology
Yes.
to talk about things like language, to distinguish between physical technology like the hammer, right? Or the laptop, whatever. But where does money fall in that? I'm not really sure. It has a physical instantiation typically, but it also has a linguistic implementation, right? That it's again the language of human action. We think through money like we think through words when we price goods and services and whatnot. So if there, so long answer to your question, but I think a philosophy of human action is where I'm at right now. That
Okay.
human action is all around us. It is ubiquitous, again, save for those reflexive behaviors, which you could maybe argue. I mean, where do you draw the line, right? That's you have those reflexive behaviors because of eons of evolution. So natural selection has programmed you with a purpose to recoil from snakes, for the leg to kick out when the doctor taps your knee.
Mm-hmm.
It's not purposeful for you, the individual, but it's purposeful for you, the species human. Right. So I think like it's all action all the way down, basically.
Yes.
And again, the only reason we can talk about it in words is because we can say something in words that words itself cannot undermine. Notice the metaphor again, undermine, to dig
Mm-hmm.
under something and disrupt it from below. Well, this is the bottom, right? This is the rock. This is the rock on which we can build our epistemological houses is action.
Yes. How does love fit in to your worldview of reality, if at all?
Yeah, love is very mysterious word. Um, you know, as mysterious as God. God is love
Mm.
in the Christian tradition. But how does it fit into my worldview? Oh, I would say when I was younger, I used to conceive of it actually as selfless action. You know, those acts you take when you purposely take an act that doesn't necessarily serve your direct individual organismic, if that's a word,
Mm-hmm.
self-interest,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if you have children, if anyone's ever had children, like you'll feel that, right? It's you'd rather see your kid eat than you eat, right? You'd rather get shot than your kid get hurt, things like this. And that's not obviously that from a selfish gene standpoint, that's still selfish behavior, right? Your genetics are protecting the possibility of your genes flowing further into the future. That when you protect your offspring, you're doing that. So that was my earlier, less sophisticated view of love growing up, just selfless action. And this is before I had such a reverence for the term action, actually. Um, I would credit Vervaeke with making my view on love more sophisticated. I really love that quote he often cites where he says that, I hope I'm saying this correctly, but love is the moment of painful realization that something other than yourself is real.
Yes.
Um, that meta existential step outside of yourself, right? He also refers to this as like a reversal of the arrow of realization. I'm sorry, the arrow of relevance, right? Immature young people, you're like, how is the world relevant to me? How
Mm.
do I get more out of what I want out of the world? How do I get people to see the way I see it? How do I get them to understand me? Like you have this very egocentric orientation to the world. And I think you could almost define maturity as the inversion of that, right? You start to say, oh, wait, how am I relevant to other people? How do I give back to the world? If I don't like this, that, and the other about the world, how do I create a difference? How do I make it easier? Even simple things, right? Like, again, when you have kids or a significant other, oh, she had a hard day at work. How do I make her night easier? Like you go from and I'm not saying this is universal. Again, echoing back a lot of what I learned from Vervaeke, and then also just kind of mapping it on my personal life that in immaturity, I felt much more concerned with me
Mm-hmm.
And then through experience, I don't know, experience and study and influence from others and adversity in life, right? You start to learn life is short. Um, it's the small things that ultimately matter. You know, that you thought you may have had these big dreams about what you were going to do, but then you might achieve some of those dreams even and realize that that's not where the real sweetness of life is. You know, like you'll accomplish these big things. You might even feel a letdown afterwards.
Yeah.
People, this
Often.
hedonic treadmill effect, right? If I could
Mm-hmm.
just get the job, or if I could just buy that house, or if I could just get this car, if I could just get this girlfriend, whatever the thing is. And then you achieve your goal that you've been working on for so many years. And then after a period of elation, right, you might feel really good about it for some time. You'll eventually have this drift back down to earth, let's say,
Yes.
this depression, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then what do you got to do? Well, you got to set another aim, another goal. Again, we're aiming creatures. If we don't have an aim, something to work towards, then we're very dissatisfiable, I guess. And so love, man, it's such a trip. You know, it's also a very loaded term in English
Of course.
because ancient Greeks had many words for love.
Uh-huh.
That absolute selfless love that you have for your child, agape,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's God is agape, not
Yes.
that God is love. You could also say, I love the bag of Doritos. That's more like eros, right? That's consumptive love.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to consume God. You don't want to consume your friends. You don't want to consume your loved ones. You want philia, right? With the ongoing reciprocal opening that Vervaeke
Mm-hmm.
talks about. And so it underlies what's crazy about love, and that this is where it makes the Bible so much more relevant. Love and faith, they underlie everything that we do in a way. Because if you want to learn something, you need to love it, right? You need to open yourself to it, your time and your attention. And then you want it to reveal itself to you and give you revelation about it, right? Whatever, even reading a book, right? You need to love it to some extent.
Yes.
If you want to know someone, well, you need to love them. And this includes someone that's not, you wouldn't traditionally say you love, right? This could be your colleague. You're just trying to get to know them as a person. Well, you need to open to them and you need to be open to them
Mm-hmm.
to get them to, not get them to invite them to
Yes.
open themselves to you and be open to you in that reciprocal process.
Mm.
So it's love is like underlying all things, you know, the even empathy, right? Like I forget which scientist this was. To understand, God, who was this? I don't remember. It was a theoretical physicist, and he was like,
Okay.
I had to become the particle. I had to like have empathy with the particle. How would the
Yes.
particle feel in these circumstances? What would it want to do? Had to like put himself in its shoes, so to speak, to develop a theoretical framework for particle physics that actually worked. You know, he had to project himself into. So there's a love there. Like you would never
Yep.
think particle physics has anything to do with love, but it's
But it
again it's
does.
pervasive. And faith too, you know, faith, this act of openness to the unknown, that we can never know things fully again, right? There's no guarantee that any of your actions will create their intended outcomes. Even if you intend to take your next breath, well, you have anything can happen, right? You have no idea. um Anything can happen. And so there's
Mm-hmm.
this, again, faith is almost like this healthy, there's the less sophisticated view of faith, belief in the supernatural, belief in the guy
Yes.
in the sky, something like that. But like that's not exactly what it is. It's this humble perspective that we're very limited in terms of what we can know, in our ability to create controlled outcomes, right? We're very limited, right? The world's very complicated. Actually, it's complex. It's more than complicated. It's complex. It's a complex adaptive system, as are we. and everything is constantly in flux and mutual adaptation. Very difficult to predict things, right? We have to constantly be responsible, meaning that we need the ability to respond to things as they change. And so faith is more about that, that we're open and reverent even of the unknown and the unknowable. And this takes us back to language, where it's like you can never have all of it contained in language or contained in any epistemic framework, right?
Mhm.
Epistemology is inherently limited, it is finite. We exist in a realm of epistemic finitude, and we cannot have infinite or totalized knowledge. And this faith, traditionally associated with theology, right, like faith in God,
Yes.
I think is a protectorant, if that's a word, a protection, let's say, against totalitarianism, which
Mm.
is that condition of totalized knowledge.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Ideas that are so good and so complete that they have to be imposed, right, with force and coercion. And there's a reason why people that, communities that tend to be more theologically inclined tend to be more resistant to
Of
totalitarianism.
course.
So all of these things, I think, go hand in hand.
Yeah, we've seen it happen. Um, do you then think that reality is also inherently relational? You said
My
it was
intuition,
rational before already, I think. So,
um, I would say my intuition says yes.
mm,
And um, I think it's in Buddhism, the concept of codependent origination. I explored a little bit. I think that's what it's called. A little bit of this in my piece, The Number Zero in Bitcoin. And before I got into Bitcoin, I read mostly Eastern philosophy.
mm,
So Buddhism, Taoism. And I think a lot of that gets at the inherent relationality of reality. That reality is not, there's no, well, what do we say? Traditionally the word substance, like we would think, oh, there's a bottom, right? There's, again, the billiard ball universe, right? Atoms,
yes.
small little indivisible spheres that all interlock together to create molecules that create elements and create everything else. I don't think that's accurate. I think it's much more like wave on wave on wave, right? It's patterns of energy all the way up and all the way down. There's a concept in physics called entrainment, which is anytime you put one vibrational pattern near another vibrational pattern over time, they start to synchronize. Um, and by the way, everything's a vibrational pattern, right? E equals
Yeah.
mc squared, right? Your table is a vibrational pattern. It's just a
Hmm.
lower frequency form of light, basically. So matter and energy are interchangeable. It's just a matter of frequency. Um, when you put if two people work together, right, they start to imitate one another, right? This is the whole mimesis thing. We all
Hmm.
imitate one another over time. When women spend a lot of time together, their menstrual cycles start to synchronize. Um, Dogs start to look like their owners. Like there's all these things that you see entrainment everywhere, and so that indicates to me that reality is much more relational. And when we say things like, oh, what is the substance? We think the world's made of stuff because it appears like it's made out of stuff to
Yeah,
us.
that's the image.
Yeah. And I get this from Vervaeke too, that substance, when Aristotle used the word substance, he didn't mean stuff. He meant that to which properties belong, but is not itself a property.
Okay.
So it is the structure to which we assign properties or to which properties attach, whether we assign them or not, hard to
Yeah.
tell. And it's not necessarily a physical thing. So, and that for me, I don't know, there's an open question there because when he says that to which properties belong but are not is not itself a property, I can't help think about the economic lens on that, which is the individual, right? the individual can own property, right? Can have relationships, fixed relationships with goods in the world, right? Like I own this house, I own this car, etc. But individuals themselves are not ownable. Individuals are all self-owned.
Yeah.
So an individual is that to which property can belong. I can own a house, I can own a car, but I cannot own other people because people are intrinsically self-owned. So on this front, though, I've just picked up a book recommended by Vervaeke, and it's by a gentleman named Hillman, I think.
Okay.
And it's I'd have to look up the title, but it's basically on this notion that we've gotten some things wrong. That in the West we adopted the Aristotelian
Metaphysics.
view, yeah, that there is stuff at the
Yeah.
bottom.
Okay.
But this is again I haven't read the book yet, but just listening to Vervaeke's pod on it, that relationality is a more apt framework for understanding how reality actually works.
Yeah.
So yeah, I want to learn more about that because I think that gets into the money and the language stuff
Mm-hmm.
a lot. And when you hear things like, in the beginning was God and God was God, the word was with God and the word was God,
Yeah.
they start to make a lot more sense when you consider that relationality is the fundamental ontology.
Mm-hmm. I think it also aligns with Persick's idea of static and dynamic quality. I think it's very closely aligned to that. And when the first time I heard this was your series with Mike Hill.
Yeah.
And it initially, like immediately, it rang true for me. And then you start to recognize it. And I do think that they're referring to the same idea. Um,
Yeah.
Same with Plato. I think I'm going to the edge of my understanding, but I'm thinking out loud here, and I think that reality is fractal. So what we
For
see in the
sure.
micro replicates in the macro. And
Mm-hmm.
perhaps what you are trying to do with this Bitcoin endeavor is to make our lived experience, to make our political reality, perhaps, or our financial reality more as reality actually is on the macro.
Mm.
Would you agree with that?
Um, First of all, I agree strongly about fractals.
Mm-hmm.
Um, where did I discover this? James Gleek, his book Chaos, then getting into Mandelbrot, obviously the inventor who coined the term.
Yeah.
Notice the metaphor there, coined the term fractal. Um, Brilliant, right? It is the geometry of nature. Nature
Yeah.
is self-similar yet non-repeating at different scales. The Mandelbrot set is one of the most beautiful mathematical things I've ever seen in my life, right? It's very simple equation, self-iterating, so it's like one little loop, and then what it generates is more complex than the universe, right? It's completely different at every scale. You can go any direction, zoom all the way in, zoom all the way out. You get these little islands of self-similarity, but it's never the same anywhere. It's
Yeah.
incredible. It's simply incredible. There's tools online, you can explore it. What am I trying to do? I mean, I guess awaken people to the reality and the irrationality, you might say, of trying to monopolize and control money, right? It's as we've tried it in the past with language, by the way, right? We've tried to outlaw words and prevent, kill bad ideas, right? Again, I wrote about this in the number zero in Bitcoin. They outlawed the Hindu Arabic numeral system. It's a fucking numeral system, right? It's literally just a way to think about the world and handle your accounting. And they were trying to make this thing outlawed because it was a threat to, it had some other implications. I won't go into detail, but
Mm-hmm.
you can't, you cannot outlaw and control ideas, right? We are idea. People don't have ideas. Ideas have people.
Yeah.
Carl Jung said, you can't control that. You can't do that. So what I'm trying to do, I guess, is to get people to take the topic of money seriously. It's like, do you
Mm-hmm.
believe in free speech? Well, then guess what? The language of human action is as important as natural language. And if that's not free, well, you can bet your ass natural language will not be free. And we're
Yeah.
seeing that today, right?
Hmm.
Social media censorship, propaganda, fake news, all of these things, all funded by fake money. The motivation for that lying is funded by the stealing that's accomplished through the counterfeiting of currency. So again, if reality is fractal, isn't there a moral fractality to reality too?
Yeah.
That if we have money that's not real, shouldn't we expect to have stories that aren't real and news that
Yes.
isn't real
Makes
and
sense.
wars that aren't real?
Hmm.
Like they're real in the sense that people are being murdered, but the story about the war is not real, right? What's going on in the Middle East right now is a genocide. There's no war over there. So there's a group of people that have a technological and economic advantage, and they're genociding another group of people.
Mm.
The story that's being told about it is funded through fake money.
Yes.
And so if we actually want, we're serious about being civilized and moral and ethical and progressing as a species, I don't think it is possible unless you address the money problem. Just like it's not possible if you don't address the free speech problem. If we tried to control speech and control what people say and control what people think and control what math they use, how far would we get?
Mm.
We would get nowhere, right? We would, whoever could do the controlling would be the one in power, and everyone else would suffer and in squalor and in some type of impoverished, irrational world, right? But no, we free speech, we let ideas compete. The best ideas win. We copy the best ideas and we build on the good ideas of one another over time. And that's how we progress as a civilization.
Mm.
Well, money is one of the most important ideas humans have ever had. And if you don't leave us free to choose the best tool for the job, then we're going to regress and decivilize. And that's a horrible outcome. So I guess at the top of the value scale for me is just human freedom.
Yep.
You just got to have faith in human freedom, right? You can't control the outcomes. You can't control the outcomes anyways. You're trying to control the outcomes now with the printing of the money or this fiat regulation or this war. Like you're trying to like force people to do a thing that you want them to do. You can't do that. You can't even control yourself to do exactly what you want yourself to do. How do you think you're going to control masses of people? So
Yep.
we have to have faith in human freedom and faith in the natural manifestations of that, which are life, liberty, and property. And so I hope whatever I'm doing on the show is just shaking that tree and getting people to look up, because right now I don't think a lot of people see it, and it is the economic water in which we swim, and the old fish swims by the two young fish and says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they just kind of look at him weird and they swim on, and then the young fish looks at the other young fish and says, What the hell is water?" No one's talking about this. It's so pervasive,
Yeah.
and that's what makes it difficult to talk about. It's like, how do you use the instrument of rationality to talk about the instrument? Like when we're talking about language, it's kind of tricky.
Yeah.
Well, when we're talking about money, it's kind of tricky, but very important. So
Very
that's my
important
aim.
indeed.
That's
I'm
my aim.
very I'm very happy you're doing it, and I think you're doing a wonderful job of that. I want to be
Thank you so
respectful
much.
of your time. Give you a couple minutes to wind down. But I think through the specific, you've done a beautiful job of understanding the bigger reality, I guess. You start with something particular, such as money, and you expand that out. And I think anyone listening to this channel will be greatly interested in your work, and I'm very happy you're doing it. So thank you for your time today, Robert.
Thank you, Lucas. Thank you for having me.
See you soon. Bye bye.